I got it open. And you all work it out.
Hi, everyone. So, we're going to be starting shortly, but I just wanted to make an announcement that we are conducting book sales to my right. And if anyone is trying to log into the Wi Fi, you have to check the terms and conditions box on the public Busboys and Poet guest. And the password is peace, PEACE123. Enjoy yourselves. Oh, so we're gonna have you sit it on the couch. Yeah, so you could be the real man of the hour. Is it too bright for you? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Wait. Okay, everyone. Thank you again for joining us tonight to celebrate Dr. Peniel Joseph's latest book, The Third Reconstruction. At this time, we ask that you silence your phones. Pictures and videos are allowed and even encouraged, but please ensure your flash is off so as to not disrupt the speaker. Full dining service is available throughout the program. Our phenomenal servers of the night, Faith and Jordan, will be taking care of you all. If you need anything, quietly and respectfully get their attention and they will be sure to assist you. After the discussion, there will be time for questions, so jot them down to not forget. Dr. Joseph will also be signing after the program, so be sure to grab a copy at the end before they are all gone. Now, for the meat of the program, Dr. Peniel Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values. founding director of the Center for the Study in Race and Democracy, and associate dean for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of award-winning books on African American history, including The Sword and the Shield and Stokely, A Life. A great recommendation for the educators out there or any close ones of an educator. He received a BA from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a PhD from Temple University. Dr. Joseph's career focus has been on what he describes as Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, and women's studies. He is a resident of Austin, Texas. The Third Reconstruction was written with the purpose of challenging Reconstructionist and redemptionist impulses that have shaped our nation since its origin. Now, without further ado, please garner a loud round of applause for Dr. Peniel E. Joseph.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be back here at Busboys and Poets. I've been coming here since it opened. Thank you, Andy, for your friendship and support. I've got Daryl Toller and David Marshall here too, some other friends. So it's great to be back here in DC. I want to start by saying what really inspired this book and giving thanks and honor to my mother, Jermaine Joseph, who's really been very, very ill, is 83 years old, and has been my biggest teacher and really the person who got me interested in activism and organizing. I grew up in Southside Jamaica, Queens, and during the 1980s, and my mother worked at Mount Sinai Hospital and was part of SCIU 1199. So I was on my first picket line over 40 years ago in New York City, the first of many demonstrations and protests. And I thought I was going to be an organizer. I didn't think I would be a scholar or a historian. And it's really my mother who talked to me and my older brother about Haitian history. She talked about the history of Pan-Africanism. In our home, we had books about Angela Davis, but the most important book I read when I was in elementary school was C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, which was at home. And my mother had both English and French language versions because my mother can speak French and Haitian and Spanish and English. And so I grew up in a household that cared about multiracial democracy, that cared about radical politics. My mother's a feminist, a human rights activist, a pro-Black, in the most capacious way possible, political and social justice advocate. So in a lot of ways, all the books that I've written, and this is number 7, really come from that very specific background. Those titles that were graciously introduced just a few minutes ago are really stand for everything that's being attacked right now in the United States and globally. We're experiencing a period of, at times, violent backlash, but we're also experiencing a period of political and racial and at times economic progress as well. And I want to explain all of that in the context of this talk. I think of this period that we're in as America's third Reconstruction from 2008 to the present. And my 4 pivot points that I argue in the book are really the election of Barack Obama, the rise of Black Lives Matter 1.0 after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and the acquittal of his murderer, and the way in which 3 Black women, activists and some who are genderqueer, radical feminists, helped to organize this BLM movement. And we'll talk about why that's so important. The third pivot point is the rise of not just Donald Trump, but the rise of a Make America Great Again movement, which is really going back to the 19th century redemptionist movement in American history, right? And the mainstreaming of that. And then finally, the 4th pivot point is really everything that's happened starting in 2020 and since. And when we think about 2020, we saw all these different juxtapositions, not aberrations, but juxtapositions between racial backlash and progress. So we saw the racially disparate impact of the pandemic. But we also saw the largest social justice movement in American history, with upwards of 26 million people out in the streets after the murder of George Floyd. And the murder of George Floyd prompted people to look back and find out about what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what happened to Breonna Taylor, who was murdered by the Louisville Police Department 2 months before George Floyd. Obviously, it called to mind what happened to Sandra Bland in Texas, Corinne Gaines in Maryland. Just so many different Black women and men who had been either overtly murdered by the police, had somehow died in police custody under suspicious circumstances, had been brutalized. Everybody from Freddie Gray to Michael Brown and so many others. At the same time, we saw this great awakening that happened in 2020, really in many ways led by Black women who are really co-architects of this Black freedom struggle, but in these earlier periods of Reconstruction have not been given their credit or their due. And in this case, we're thinking about everyone from Tamika Mallory and Alicia Garza and Ayo Tameti to Stacey Abrams and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Kimberly Crenshaw and Keonga Yamada Taylor, Angela Davis, just so many different others, you know, Beth Ritchie, the Ruthie Gilmores, the Barbara Ransbys, so many different folks who've been organizing over a long period of time, some who are younger organizers. And what was so interesting about that was that they called for the most expansive vision of American democracy that we've seen, right? And that's why when we think about that, even that slogan, Black Lives Matter, the idea that all Black lives matter was always this challenge and provocation, not just to white supremacists and patriarchy and racial capitalists, but also within our own community, because we know that within our own community, I'm talking about Black folks here, but also people of color, we've marginalized historically women and people who are queer and folks who are disabled and folks who are poor. And so this idea of saying all Black lives matter was a real important provocation. Now, the positives, before I start talking about the negatives and getting into the history, the positives are really many, and sometimes we ignore them. The Biden-Harris administration is a reconstructionist administration. And I'll give those definitions of reconstructionist and redemptionist in a second. But it's a progressive administration within the context of mainstream American politics, because the grassroots did that from the bottom up, right? Joe Biden in the 1990s is a redemptionist, tough on crime, law and order, welfare reform. We have to remember that. And we have to understand that those who occupy reconstructionist and redemptionist polls don't always stay there, depending on the historical context and the political context. They can always be pressured, right? And so when we think about the positives, there would be no pandemic relief bill. There would be no effort at student debt relief. There would be no infrastructure act. There would be no equity bills. There would be no first Black woman on the Supreme Court. There would be no this administration has appointed the most Black women federal justices in American history. All of that was done because of the uprisings and the rebellions and the organized political activity that occurred in 2020, but that has a much longer history, which we'll talk about in this discussion. So that's the positive. The negative is what we're seeing all around us, especially since 2021. For a moment, it seemed that there was going to be a sea change in American politics. For a moment, everyone was saying Black Lives Matter, including corporations. Obviously, there was a lot of performative politics, but it seemed like that might be a moment to really transform and bring us more redistributive justice. And instead, what we've seen is the anti-CRT bills and the critical race theory hoax, which is really the suppression of Black history, the suppression of American history. The folks who are doing this are authoritarian, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-Muslim, they're deeply misogynist, but also in a key way misogynoir as well. They're deeply homophobic and queerphobic and transphobic. They're deeply anti-human. But this is not the first time this has happened in American history. This is not the first time. And that's where we get to this book, this idea of the Third Reconstruction. In terms of just definitions, what I argue in this book is that to understand the period of time we're in today, we have to go back to really right after the Civil War and the first period of American Reconstruction. And I argue for a long Reconstruction period from 1865 to 1898, and not the short Reconstruction that ends after the election of 1876. And just in terms of definitional terms, I define Reconstruction and Reconstructionists as supporters of multiracial democracy in an intersectional way, even in the 19th century, right? Martha Jones's brilliant book, Vanguard, shows you aspects of this. But really the work of Deborah Gray White, the work of Beth Ritchie, the work of Dinah Ramey Berry, there's so many different historians who've done wonderful work looking at Black women in the 19th century, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, so many from multiple class levels, multiple ideological levels. But what we see in that context is that we had folks who were pushing for radically inclusive democracy in the context of the 19th century. A lot of times Black women were leaders here simply by necessity, right? Sometimes they were joined by Black men like Frederick Douglass, who's a feminist, who's a radically inclusive pro-democracy champion and champion of Black political self-determination. Sometimes Black men were too enthralled by patriarchy and resisted the idea of Black women having not only the right to vote, but the right to be co-leaders, and co-architects of American democracy. And so when we think about Reconstructionists, they're supporters of multiracial democracy, and they do this in many different ways. They do this by building Black churches. They do this by building schools and educational institutions. They build civic institutions and mutual aid societies that provide health care. They do not just rely on the government. The Freedmen's Bureau is an experiment that lasts 7, 8, 9 years, doesn't last that long. They do this in incredible ways by becoming local and state and national officials, right? A great book here is Stephen Hahn's A Nation Under Our Feet. Certainly the GOAT of all Reconstruction studies is W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction, 1934. But there's many others. Obviously the work of Eric Foner, but there's Tavolia Glimpf. There's so many different historians and folks who've done great work on this. Reconstructionists are important because what Black Reconstructionists do is reimagine American democracy, and they offer the country the first New Deal. Before Roosevelt, it's Black politicians who set up infrastructure in South Carolina, in Texas. They build roads and bridges. They create the public school system. They create the first anti-poverty efforts and hospitals and public utilities and universities in the entire country in the South that's being reconstructed. So even as we often think about redemption during this period, and we think about the Confederate statues and the monuments, we often fail to give Black people credit for transforming the built environment of the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, over 700,000 Americans are killed, but also so much of the built environment is destroyed in Virginia, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Texas. So much is destroyed, and Black people are key to rebuilding that. No, they don't support the Confederate monuments, but they build up so many roads and bridges and churches and infrastructure that the country had never had. So those are Reconstructionists for a moment. The redemptionists are both advocates of white supremacy, but they're more. The redemptionists, again, they are violent advocates of white supremacy, but it's more than that. Redemptionists are advocates of the lost cause. So what the lost cause provides is a story and justification and rationalization for the murder and the dismemberment and the destruction of Black citizenship and dignity in perpetuity. So the South loses the war, but they win the peace, and they win the peace because they are aided and abetted by white collaborators who are at times Reconstructionists, but most of the time become redemptionists. And that's the truth. That's the truth, right? And so just like we had fake white allies in 2020, we had fake white allies in 1865, in 1866, and 1867 as well. That when it seemed like Black people were going to get citizenship, they were all on board, and when Congress forced the secession states to hold state legislatures that had to include Black men and had to include multiracial democracy, they were all in it. Right. And that's why they had names for Republicans. They called them carpetbaggers, the white South. White racists called them baggers. Those were white Republicans who came in from the North and were wanting to build new political and economic coalitions with those Black people who are now going to be not just a voting bloc, but they were going to be elected officials. They were going to be entrepreneurs. They were going to be folks who were part of a new emerging political and economic class. The domestic white folks in the South who were willing to work with Black folks were called scalawags because they were willing to look back at that old order and just politically organize with the new order. What redemptionism does through Mississippi shotgun policy, through racial pogroms and massacres, way before Tulsa. The first Tulsa is Memphis in 1866 and New Orleans in 1866 and the Hamburg Massacre in 1873. All these things that Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott don't want our kids knowing about. They don't want our kids knowing about it is because these narratives matter. These narratives are not just about the past. The stories we tell ourselves are about the present and the future society that we're going to build. So we can tell ourselves a story where we scapegoat Black people and Jewish people and queer people, and we scapegoat people who are from Mexico and Latin America and Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and Africa, and we set up policies and we set up legislation and we set up laws that justify the scapegoating, or we can do the exact opposite. We can set up stories that tell us about multiracial democracy, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and set up policies, set up a legislative and legal and cultural and economic framework that makes that story come true, right? So when we think about redemptionists are very important because what that lost cause does between 1865 and 1898, it parallels the Reconstruction movement. So there's a movement for Reconstruction, and sometimes we hear about folks like Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper and Francis Harper and Frederick Douglass, but they're really just names. What did they do? Well, what they did is they were the first advocates of a multiracial democracy. Lincoln called it a new birth of freedom at the Gettysburg Address in 1863 in November, but these were the Black folks who actually made it come true, at least for a short time. So what we're going to see between 1865 and 1898 are archipelagos of fugitive democracy, including in places like DC, but throughout the South, rural, urban. You're going to see it in Tennessee, in Virginia. You're going to see it in Texas. You're going to see it in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. South Carolina comes out of the Civil War as a majority Black state. That's why you see so much bloodshed, anti-Black bloodshed in South Carolina, right? That's Benjamin Tillman and the red shirts. And when we think about white supremacy in this context, it's not just the Klan. The Klan is just a shorthand for violent white Confederates in the United States after the Civil War. There's different groups, the Knights of the White Camellia, the red shirts. They have dozens and dozens of different names. But it's important for us to remember, many of these folks are pastors and preachers and politicians. Many of these folks fought in the Civil War on the wrong side, and instead of being executed for treason and placed in jail and criminalized, they became governors and lieutenant governors and senators, and they resumed ownership of plantations that should have been legally redistributed to Black folks in a reparative move to save the country in the aftermath of the Civil War. So when we think about that first Reconstruction, 1865 to 1898, what redemptionists do through the lost cause, both through political violence, legal violence, a convict lease system that sets up mass incarceration, a sharecropping and peonage system that marginalizes Black labor and so terrorizes Black people that even in the 1870s and 1880s, they're migrating westward to not have men, women, and children raped and murdered and maimed by white racists in the United States. Like, this is our history. Like, all of this happened. And so redemptionists not only terrorize Black folks and the nation, they set up a story that justifies that terror. So before 20th century iterations of that story, like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, you have all these different magazines and Daughters of the Confederacy and a kind of pulp fiction that lies about the Civil War, that sets up a context of happy slaves, that says the war was not fought over slavery, it was about states' rights, and sets up Black men as these rapacious serial sexual assaulters who need to be lynched in order to have any kind of law and order and peace in the South, right? And it's important for us to know that the North goes right along with this. There aren't a bunch of white heroes in this story. There are some, but there's not a lot. There's Thaddeus Stevens. There are some white radical Reconstructionists who believe in political and social equality. It's not a lot. It's not a lot. All right. So when we say, hey, there were white abolitionists too, not a lot, not the majority. Let's not lie to the children too. You know, it's not a bedtime story. It's our history. Right. And so when we look at that period, and I do 1865 to 1898, because 1865, ratification of the 13th Amendment, Juneteenth, of course, emancipation really becomes real. And 1898 is the white massacre of Black folks in Wilmington, North Carolina, over a 3-day period where thousands of troops, both militia, police, slaughter Black folks who are leading Wilmington, North Carolina at the end of the 19th century. So Wilmington goes from being a 50-50 Black-white city to less than 6% Black folks after that, up until this day. There's never been any real federal intervention in Wilmington then or now. Wilmington over the last 3 decades has had many different commissions and committees that have tried to come to terms with this. In 2021, Wilmington finally buried a Black man, Joshua Halsey, who was murdered in 1898, father of 4, and left in an unmarked grave to rot. They finally acknowledged his murder and gave him a real grave in 2021. So this history is all around us, right? And that first Reconstruction, as I pivot into the second, and I'll close, is really important because Reconstructionists lose the narrative war of that first Reconstruction. One of the things that I argue is that everything that's happening right now in the United States can be boiled down to a narrative war between Reconstructionists and Redemptionists. And by narrative war, I don't mean something that's just literary. I mean it's a story for public consumption it's in churches, it's in synagogues, it's in mosques, right? It's in K through 12 public and private schools. It's in higher ed. It's in every fabric of our lives. It's in music. It's in movies. It's in everything. And one story tells the story of Reconstruction, and the other story tells the story of redemption, right? And the reason why we get not just Tulsa, but East St. Louis, and we get Elaine, Arkansas, and we get Rosewood, Florida, and we get the Atlanta riot in 1906. These are all white riots and pogroms against Black people. In Atlanta, they put Sam Hose's knuckles after they lynched him in a butcher store. They put the knuckles of a Black man in a butcher store. W.E.B. Du Bois saw that and almost had a nervous break. Well, he had a nervous breakdown. It's not almost. He had a nervous breakdown after seeing it. That's the country. It's not just postcards of lynching. It's emasculating Black men. It's putting the knuckles of innocent Black men and women who were burned alive, right? And that's what Du Bois starts off the third Black Reconstruction with. He says, here is a world, a nation where God was worshipped wildly, that has all this pastoral beauty, and where even in the 20th century, human beings are burned alive. That's what he starts Black Reconstruction with, right? And so when we think about the second Reconstruction between 1954 and 1968, and I use that circa 1954 to 68 as really just the high points of the second Reconstruction. You could start the second Reconstruction with the Great Depression, the anti-colonial, Second World War, freedom movements, the Paul Robesons, the Ella Bakers, absolutely. And you can go past King's assassination into the 1970s, where there's a radical multiracial labor movement. There are anti-apartheid movements. We just lost Randall Robinson, really one of the giants of the 20th century. One of the giants of the 20th century. Randall Robinson is one of the most important people of the 20th century who taught us about this connection between our freedom and the liberation of Africa through Trans-Africa. One of the pivotal people involved in the liberation of Nelson Mandela and the freedom of South Africa and other parts of the continent, Randall Robinson. And of course, became a best-selling author for discussing reparations, having a series of books talking about the debt that was owed to Black people. So Randall Robinson's unbelievably important, and we just lost him. When we think about this idea of a second Reconstruction, that second Reconstruction becomes unbelievably important because Reconstructionists win the narrative war during the second Reconstruction, and that's why we're all here today. We couldn't have Busboys and Poets. We couldn't have this multiracial room without it. And we can see we're in a different phase because I go back over 30 years with DC, and I've never seen this many white folks in this area of DC in my entire life, ever. Okay, I remember when there was no 13th Street Museum Cardoza spot to do research at Howard University. We got off at 7th, right? And crack was right there, just like the show Snowfall, and you were accosted. Being from New York City, I didn't blink because we had it worse in New York City, I thought. But it was a whole different landscape, you know? And I remember being in grad school and when I had white colleagues and they said, we're doing civil rights, and the Black folks would be like, yeah, we're going to go to Moreland Spingarn. We're going to go to Howard University archives. You know, we're going to do it. And then the white folks would be like, man, that's really dangerous. You guys are brave. You guys are brave to go to the archive on Howard's campus. But this is real. This is real talk, right? This is a whole different DC. But when we think about Reconstructionists winning that narrative war, what do I mean? The civil rights, Black power movements are not perfect. They have all kinds of flaws and shortcomings. But what they are able to do is make the argument, the positive argument, that racial justice is a moral and political good. And so what you start seeing, especially between 1963 all the way up into the Shelby Holder decision in 2013, is a 50-year interregnum that I call a racial justice consensus. Doesn't mean there's not mass incarceration. It doesn't mean all types of grotesque things happen. But what it does mean, in the whole history of the United States, and in 2026, it's going to be 250 years, that period of 1963 to 2013 is a time where more Black women, people of color, build more wealth, more access, have more education, have higher incomes, and have more political and economic and cultural impact in the United States and globally than ever before. So, and that's the truth. All the data backs us up, right? And it doesn't mean that that's perfect. It doesn't mean that that's perfect. And I'm not even talking about praising a dynamic of tokenism, because it's not just tokenism. There's tokenism for sure in that second Reconstruction, but it really sets up a whole new paradigm for American democracy. Now, the election, and I'm going to close here, the election of Barack Obama, a lot of people thought that was closing the chapter on racial injustice. After his election, people even said that we were going to be living in a post-racial United States. You know, Black folks, no more excuses. Look at Obama, right? No more excuses, right? Obama was not really the end of something. He was really the beginning of a new phase in American history. And I argue that that new phase is this idea of a third reconstruction that's really coming not just from the top down, because people think about Obama sort of, the president, but even Obama's election was based on a social movement. It was a social movement that got Obama elected, even as after he was elected, he did not continue to be in coalition with that social movement, except when he needed votes in elections, right? And I think the Obama election taught a lot of people hard lessons about American democracy and electoral politics at the high level, right? And at times people need to pay as much attention to local politics as they do national politics, right? And so when we think about this new phase, we see striking juxtapositions just like we did during the first two periods of Reconstruction, right? So at the same time that you see the first Black president, you also see extraordinary gerrymandering that goes back to the 19th century. You also see voter suppression that goes back to the 19th century. You also see a rise in white hate groups and gun violence that really goes back to the 19th century, although we're now doing it in unprecedented numbers. Both the Obama elections and the Trump elections, for different reasons, triggered more enthusiasm among white militia and white supremacist, neo-Nazi, alt-right, white nationalist groups. It also, both of those elections in 2008, 2012, but 2016 as well, precipitated huge increases in gun sales for different reasons, right? The right wing went out and purchased a bunch of guns after both of Obama's elections because conspiracy theorists, even pre-QAnon, spread lies that the president, by executive order, was going to take everybody's guns, right? The election of Donald Trump precipitated more hate groups and more gun buying because white supremacist groups said, now we've got our own Andrew Johnson in the White House. Andrew Johnson, after the assassination of Lincoln, pardoned Confederates by the tens of thousands and allowed a new regime of white supremacy to really engulf the Black community. And in some ways, those years between 1865 and 1868, after Lincoln's assassination at the Ford Theater in April of 1865, all the way up until really Johnson's impeachment unsuccessfully by one vote in the Senate in 1868. In certain ways, Black folks never really recovered from that in a way, because those were the years where perhaps if Lincoln had remained president, we would have seen much more vigilant enforcement of the Freedmen's Bureau, much more vigilant enforcement of the struggle for dignity and citizenship for Black people. So this third Reconstruction really encompasses so many of the juxtapositions of the first and second Reconstructions, but we've not really understood it in that way. And I'll close by talking about Black women in this third Reconstruction. My book really centers Black women like Ida B. Wells and the Angela Davises and the Ella Baker and the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Tamika Mallories and the Stacey Abrams through three periods of Reconstruction. The reason why I think this is important is that it really took this third Reconstruction for the full-blown public acknowledgement of Black women as co-architects of this Black liberation movement, right? Both Black feminists and at times radical Black queer feminists, but also ordinary everyday Black women like my mother, who were really instrumental to not only keeping the Black family thriving, even as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said the exact opposite. And Angela Davis pushes back in 1971 from a prison cell, which I write about, and looks at that. She does that great essay about Black women during racial slavery that pushes back against the Moynihan thesis and this idea that somehow the Black family is dysfunctional, and really looks at what Black women did to resist sexual assault and rape and violence and so many other injustices at great risk to themselves in the context of racial slavery and after. So it's a really important essay in the Black Scholar, published in 1971 and written while Angela Davis was facing really the death penalty on 3 felony counts in the attempted breakout of prison of George Jackson by his younger brother Jonathan Jackson at the Marin County Courthouse in 1970. So that's very important. But I think the 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah-Jones and the work of people like Kimberly Crenshaw and others has really been hugely important during this third Reconstruction, because we have millions of people have gotten access for the first time to an alternative origin story for the United States of America. And the reason why we're seeing such a huge backlash, the 1776 Commission didn't work in 2020, but critical race theory did. Critical race theory did, is that there's an understanding that this narrative war persists, and that really for the first time in American history, we're able to tell the story about Black liberation in the United States, of multiracial democracy, of a radically inclusive democracy on a scale that is unprecedented in American and global history. 1619 Project's not only a bestseller, it's on Hulu, right? And so many thousands of teachers were using it pedagogically because it's a multimedia kit. But it's not just that. It's also Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and all the spinoffs there. There's so many different ways in which Reconstructionists are actually making progress, that this at times violent backlash is to be expected. But understanding this provides us a context for hope. And I agree with Mariam Kaba, the abolitionist, who talks about hope as a discipline. But I think hope is not only a discipline, it's also in action. It's in our action. All of us who are fighting the good fight, we have to share our stories, both our personal stories, of course, but we have to share the way in which our personal stories fit within this larger narrative of multiracial democracy. We can talk about Native American dispossession. We can talk about what happened to Chinese Americans. We think about the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can talk about the Braceros program and what's happened to immigrants from Mexico, and how Confederates wanted to turn Mexico into a slave empire, right? They wanted Mexico, Central America, Haiti, Cuba, the whole deal, right? But we can also talk about the way in which Black folks and those who stood in solidarity with them have not only pushed back against those things like racial slavery and colonialism, but have also engaged in this beautiful struggle, right? And it's a beautiful struggle. And I get that term from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who during his April 4th, 1967 Riverside speech talks about a bitter but beautiful struggle to transform American democracy. And in that speech, he says he's going to criticize America, but he's going to criticize America because he loves America, right? And so often when we think about these stories, those of us who want to tell a fuller story of America, and this is a global story, by the way, because this is going to involve every single corner of the world, because America has been historically really the biggest empire in recent world history. I get it. Everybody who loves England out there, I get it. The sun never sets on the English empire. There was a time, but right now, for the past century or so, and remember Henry Luce and the American century, we're still right there. We're in competition with China now, but we still are an empire. So this is a global story as well. But the hope is found in sharing our stories and understanding what these stories mean. The reason why Florida and Texas are under siege right now, and this is only the first step, is because it's not just about history. That's what people have to understand. The fight is not just about history. The fight is about the present and the future. The fight is not about textbooks. The fight is about your life and redistributive justice and whether it's going to happen or not. The fight is about criminal justice reform and really the abolition of poverty, the abolition of punishment, the abolition of prison, the abolition of police. That's the fight, right? So this textbook fight, all this is a proof of concept. Just like Trump's big lie, that's just a proof of concept so another president can say, hey, I didn't lose the election, I'm not leaving, and I've got the military on my side. That's all that is. That's just a proof of concept. So we have to understand what the stakes are. And I'll conclude by saying this. All of us who have thought to ourselves or imagined and said, what would I have done during the second Reconstruction? Martin Luther King Jr., Angela Davis, Muhammad Ali, what would I have done? Or what would I have done if I lived during the time of racial slavery? You know, Harriet Tubman. You're in it right now. You don't have to ask anymore. You're in it right now. You are in that watershed historical period right now. We have cell phones, it's social media, but you're in it right now. You are in as pivotal a time period as the 1960s and the Black Panthers. You are in as pivotal a time period as antebellum slavery and abolitionism. You are in as pivotal a time period as Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. As I was walking down U Street, I was thinking to myself, have Black people ever had like an owned, just great square blocks of a city and a place just like this with this new U Street, and I said, yes, we have. And what happened there was we got burnt out. Yes, we've had. And it's not just the Greenwood section of Tulsa. We've had that happen to us over and over again, right? And so that history is what we have to understand we are living through right now. And unless we find that story and understand the centrality of that story to not just the past, but the present and the future, we're headed for more periods of Reconstruction instead of finally achieving multiracial democracy, which should have been achieved during the first Reconstruction. Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long.
All right. During this time, we'll open the floor to you all for any questions in the house. Do I have all right?
Thank you so much. It was enlightening. My name is Tunji Williams. I come here normally for the open mics. It was nice to see the presentation. I got a lot from it. My question is a simple one. I wonder, you provoked those of us who aren't familiar with Reconstruction or the empirical definition of Reconstruction. I think you've informed us. But what I want to know is, what's the prescription? So if I can see Reconstruction coming from a mile away, how do I ready myself? How do I equip myself and my community to take best advantage of it? What does it mean for the average person, the practical activist?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I think the prescription is one, knowing, I think not enough of us, both, especially Black people who are like my audience, who I'm writing to, but really all Americans know enough about this history. So I think that one, knowing our history and the story really, really matters. The other is, I think that when you think about understanding Reconstructionists and redemptionists, you have an understanding, once you know the history, of what the stakes are. Because sometimes I think people vote and support redemptionist policies, like including at times Black people, building up more prisons, putting people away. I don't want homeless camps near me. People who are disabled or HIV positive or who are queer and all these different things. I think not knowing the story at times makes us complicit in the marginalization and the oppression of our own people and in the rising stakes of authoritarianism, especially when you look at some of the voting data and the folks who voted for Trump and who supported this kind of authoritarianism context. The other part of it, though, is that I think understanding Reconstruction in this period, these 3 periods of Reconstruction, provides us a context to have a political strategy. And I think that political strategy should be one of both Black political and economic and cultural self-determination, but also at the same time of coalition building around big issues when we need to, issues like voting rights, issues like ending mass incarceration, and thinking about this term that Du Bois introduced in 1934, abolition democracy. And what Du Bois meant by abolition democracy was not just the end of racial slavery and the eradication of those systems of punishment. He also talked about redistributive justice and the appearance of structures and systems and processes where we could guarantee that Black people and all people would actually flourish in the United States. And when I write about Dr. King, I talk about that in the sense of Dr. King pursuing what I call Black radical citizenship, and Malcolm X pursuing Black radical dignity. So for King, citizenship was not just voting rights, it was food justice, the end of violence, the end of segregation. It was redistributive justice and a guaranteed income, right? It was decent housing fit for human beings. And Malcolm, his idea of radical dignity was that we were all born with it, right? This idea of dignity was really, really important to Malcolm. And citizenship is just the external recognition of dignity. But for the longest time, Malcolm pushed back on those who were trying to persuade white institutions to recognize Black people's dignity, right? Because Malcolm said that should be a given for ourselves. Over time, he comes and converges with King, at least to the point of saying dignity and citizenship should come hand in hand. Still never agrees with King in the idea of self-defense versus nonviolence. So I think those are two. And the other thing I would say about it is that I think understanding the story is very, very powerful because it teaches our children where they fit in. Because our children, and I'm talking about our Black children here, but I'm also talking about our children who are under siege and marginalized, who might not be Black as well, who are children of color, who are queer children. Our children are being raised in a very, very antagonistic, anti-human society. In a lot of ways, they don't understand why their identities trigger such violence against them and such hatred against them and such ill sentiment and ill feelings and disrespect and terror against them, their families, their parents, their communities. And so understanding that story is key, because the first step towards your own political empowerment is self-knowledge. And that's where, Malcolm X was right about that, the Nation of Islam. But even before the Nation of Islam, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells were saying the same thing. Carter Woodson, Miseducation of Negro, was saying the same thing, right? And Carter Woodson has this extraordinary background, two parents who were born into slavery, who work, both mom and dad, and provide him a context where he becomes the second Black person to get a PhD from Harvard. And then he writes Miseducation of the Negro, but also creates Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, creates Black History Week, which becomes Black History Month. And he creates, Carter Woodson is probably the person, whereas Du Bois did it at this high level, at the grassroots level, who was the biggest pushback against the white supremacist lost cause industry by the Daughters of the Confederacy, by the Dunning School that writes textbooks and histories and memorials that blasted Black people and set up this country that continued to place us in bondage, that went beyond stereotypes. The reason why you see the residential and the public school segregation, but also the super capitalist exploitation of Black communities, both then and now, that was justified by the lost cause, right? And it continues to be justified. The reason why they're so scared of the K through 12 curriculum changing is because that curriculum justifies our death and our immiseration in perpetuity forever and ever. That's what Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, his cornerstone speech said, that the cornerstone of our new Confederate States of America is Negro servitude and slavery forever. That's what they believed, forever. And we've got schools named after Robert E. Lee. I mean, like Dr. King said, we are a sick society. And Dr. King said he didn't cause the racism. He's getting all these death threats from white people who are out of their minds. And he said, I didn't cause the racism. I'm the physician diagnosing the disease, right? So you're naming buildings after Robert E. Lee and terrorists, genocidal, homicidal maniacs, and you're naming buildings and worshiping at their feet. And you think we're not going to continue to reproduce that sick society. You're not naming buildings after Thaddeus Stevens. You're not building monuments to white abolitionists. You're not building monuments to the 200,000 black folks who fought in the Civil War and died and ensured all of our freedom, right? They keep on talking about the greatest generation. Tom Brokaw, of course, it was a bunch of white guys in World War II, and doesn't talk about the black folks and the Latino folks and the indigenous and the Japanese folks and the Asian folks who served in World War II in a segregated military who died at disproportionate rates, right? So that story we have to know. And once we know that story and our kids know that story, by any means necessary, we are in a much better position to strategize for ourselves, but also build coalitions across our specific identity and racial and ethnic groups.
Hello, there we go.
Hello. I'm very proud to be here today because I'm a Haitian American, and so thank you, thank you for your words of wisdom. You are new to me, so I'm really soaking this in. But the one challenge I'm having is that you began your presentation by saying that this is our story. I don't feel in control of what is happening. I don't feel empowered to help make a change. I feel like I want to run, but running doesn't help either because Europe is in the same mindset. Everybody seems to be in the mindset of minimizing, and making me feel less than worthy. So the language for me is what I'm struggling with in terms of our story.
Yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from. And I think the reason why I say it's our story, I do a lot of work on Martin Luther King Jr. and the idea of a beloved community, right? And I do believe in that idea of a beloved community. What King meant by a beloved community was a community that was both free of economic despair and racial injustice and oppression of all people, but also a community that invested in people and allowed us all to flourish, right? And I do think that, we do have this shared story. I think one of the reasons why people were so scared about the 1619 Project, the book that I teach, so I'm intimately, in there. I teach it chapter by chapter. We go through it for the whole semester. So I'm teaching it, right? Is that it tells our collective story, but it also tells a story about Native people, indigenous people. It tells a story about people who are of Mexican and Puerto Rican and Dominican descent. It tells a story about people who are from Asia and South Asia. It tells a story about white folks, including abolitionists and those who are segregationists. There's a global component to the 1619 Project where, Haiti is there and other parts are there. We couldn't have the American Revolution without the Haitian Revolution. Haitians fought at the Battle of Savannah in the American Revolution. Haitians are the ones who provide a context and that revolution for the doubling and tripling of the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase, because Haitians are kicking the ass of Napoleon and the French army. Haitians kicked the Spanish out. They kicked the English out. They kicked the French out. They went from being a colony of enslaved people into a republic of citizens for the first time in the Western Hemisphere. And they inspired Frederick Douglass. They inspired Gabriel Prosser. They inspired Nat Turner. They inspired John Brown. And in repayment, they got an embargo. Thomas Jefferson, before the Cuban embargo, Haiti is the first place that was embargoed, right? And they had the French indemnity that the New York Times just found out about last year and acted like they discovered America. New York Times, I don't know if you knew about this French indemnity, and all the black folks and the Haitian scholars and, are like, well, we've thought about it once or twice, right? And so the New York Times, like, just guess what we discovered, right? And so when you think about that story, though, it really encompasses all of us. And I think this is where I think this idea of solidarity, and I've learned this from my mother, is really important. Solidarity is different from allyship because, as you can see, allies disappear, right? Allies are political. Allies are at times performative, right? But solidarity is important because it's based on proximity. So you're really standing on the picket line, the demonstration. You're going to jail together. You know, Stokely Carmichael went to jail, Kwame Ture, over 40 times as a civil rights activist, including jailing in Mississippi John Lewis at 19 years old and celebrating his 20th birthday in prison on a hunger strike with John Lewis. And he was always cursing John Lewis out, saying, "I'm never doing a hunger strike in prison again," because they went so many days without food. So solidarity means we can see the people and the groups who are right next to us, right? They're right there in the trenches with us. And that's how we get that shared collective story. So here I get back to the 2020 movement and moment with Black Lives Matter. In the book, in the Third Reconstruction, I talk about the June 15th Black Trans Lives Matter march in Brooklyn and how important that was because we stood in solidarity with each other. You know, the only way we're going to change this, you know, either everybody counts or no one counts. We can't in this room even, but also in the United States and the world, have a favorite scapegoat. We can't. We can't say, well, I want freedom for everybody else, everybody, but, and then you have, you know, and we start it all over again, right? And so the reason why I say our story is that, one, I believe it, but two, I've seen it in practice. And I think one of the proof of concepts was not just 2020, but it was really starting with both the Obama movement, but then BLM 1.0. I was in Boston when and was at demonstrations where highways were shut down, everything was shut down. And it was absolutely Black led and it was Black women led and all these different things. But we really saw other groups there with us. There were white folks who were going to jail. There were Asian folks who were going to jail. There were Latinx folks who were going to jail. It was queer and straight folks. So you saw it, disabled folks. They were elderly and young, right? So it is our story. And I think the best way to not feel like you want to run, because on some levels, where are you going to escape to? I tell people that all the time. I'm a native New Yorker, and they're like, man, you know, I'm in Texas. They're like, man, how bad is Texas? I'm like, it's as bad as where you're at. The whole country's bad. Right? It's not, you know, it's not like, oh man, you go to the state of Washington and it's free of racism, right? If we found that place, we'd move there. You know, if all the Black people would tell me, hey, Peniel, here's the place to go, the zip code, and there's no racism. I'm like, word? Are you serious? Right? There's no racism, right? I mean, where you can be in Prince George's County, you can be in majority Black counties, and you're still being treated a certain way by law enforcement and all this stuff. You're still having problems with your mortgages and all this stuff, right? You've seen the news stories where the Black folks are trying to sell their house and it's devalued by $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. Then they get their white friend. They take all the Black stuff out. So take the dashikis out, take the pictures of the Black folks out, right? And then the appraiser, the same appraiser or the same appraisal company says, oh man, this is worth a ton because I don't see any mark of Black people, right? So Black people, just by being in a home, even if it's in a predominantly white neighborhood, the appraisers are so psychologically distorted with racism, they devalue the home because they say as soon as Black people are in it, we've infected it. Yeah, we've infected it, right? So there's no way out, which is why we have to try to change and transform. And that's why I think King, very, very important lesson, that idea of a beloved community. It's not going to be just an island of prosperity that we're going to just thrive on, right? We're going to have to, and you know, I understand that it can get tough and lonely and tired, and you know, the movement is always a marathon. This is not a 100-yard dash, and you know, we want to see positive change in our lifetime, but even if we don't, we have to continue the struggle. Yep.
So I saw the next question, but before I hand off the mic, I see that we have young, intelligent minds in the house. If you all want to ask some questions as well, please do.
Hi, thanks.
Yes.
thanks so much for your comments and for your great work. I was hoping you could just riff a little bit more about the function of education that you see in the third Reconstruction. You know, you talked about the first Reconstruction, we got public schooling out of it, you know, universal public schooling. The second one, you know, we got free breakfast programs that came from the Panthers and got incorporated into the education system. And now with the demographic change where the majority of students are students of color now, so what's education's sort of function and connection going to be to this sort of third Reconstruction that you've been thinking about?
Well, I think education is critical. I think one of the reasons why we see so much disinvestment in public education is because public education is now, the consumers of public education are now a majority of people of color, right? And this same trend happened in higher education. As soon as Black people started to go into higher education by the late 70s, on par demographically with white students, you started to see disinvestments in the New York State public education system, higher education, rather, California, North Carolina, the South, the whole thing, right? And right now we're, excuse me? And women too, women and Black folks. And so, no, I think that education is hugely important. I think even the charter school debate and the notion of certain states saying now they're not going to take any money from the federal government because the federal government is too woke. The efforts to divert federal money, which really starts under the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson, the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965, that puts the federal government in the education business through these big grants. Education is pivotal because education is the biggest leveler for poor Black communities and poor Latino communities and just poor people in general. There's always going to be the outliers who through athletic prowess or STEM genius or poetry genius in the arts, they level up and are able to build wealth and equity because of their talents. But for most of us who are not those outliers, education, and most of us, you know, I went to state school, State University of New York at Stony Brook, and then PhD at Temple, which is a Commonwealth school, which is a public school. So for those of us who were never had access to the privilege of you know, Ivy League institutions or very, very private institutions, public school education is where it's at, and it should be a universal good. So here's a couple of things. I mean, one, we have to push to make community college free. We have to push for complete student debt relief. That is an amnesty. That means a zero, not 20 or 50,000 off. And the thing is, when you say this, it's just like the 8-hour workday. There was a time in the country where people worked from sun up, you know, can't see in the morning to can't see at night, right? And it was obviously the innovators here are Black folks who were enslaved and considered a species of property. Now that's not the case. So it's Black people who really have been the biggest pro-union people in the United States. We have led the most important labor movements in the United States. Obviously, we've faced huge labor discrimination from AFL-CIO, which is why you have Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. But really, even going back, when you think about Birmingham and the work of Robin Kelly and all these different folks, we are the people who've dreamed impossible dreams, made things happen in the country become better, but then are usually marginalized and purposely erased from the benefits, right? And especially this happens with European immigrants who come and enjoy benefits of white skin privilege, civil rights acts, white women, especially since 1964, enjoy much more economic access and much more political access than they ever did, even as they bifurcate their movement like they did in the 19th century. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did the same thing. Big falling out with Frederick Douglass, who was riding trains with them and was in coalitions with them until they said, this nigga's going to get the vote and I'm not going to get the vote. And they said it to him like that. And he said, whoa, we ain't friends no more. That's I'm paraphrasing, but that happened. That actually happened. People think, and people, oh my gosh, you used the N-word. Yeah, I'm using it in their voice, okay? right? So it's important to say that the thing we need from education is both the debt relief and the amnesty, free community college. But for those of us who are sending our kids to public schools, we have to be part and parcel, if we can, of those parent-teacher associations, the school boards. Do everything in your power to ensure that your child is getting that proper education. And even, I think one of the worst things that's happened in education is this real big push with STEM, because not all kids are going to get science, technology, engineering, and math. And as you can see with the fate of the country, we need poets, we need music, we need art, we need performers, we need folks who are interested in literature, we need folks who are interested in social work and education, right? Alongside of that. And in many ways, those who are interested in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences are the people who should be at the head of the table and making us think long and hard about AI and think about the Dobbs decision and voter suppression, right? So when we think about the education we want, I think this third Reconstruction, it's really important because one, we can see somebody like Nicole Hannah-Jones from Waterloo, Iowa. She really just launched just 4 years ago the most impactful sort of pedagogical project related to Black history really ever conceived, just in terms of its aggregate impact. You know what I mean? Away from debating, Du Bois versus and stuff. I'm just saying its impact, the number of eyeballs and people who know about it, right? Because for those of us who've been students of Black history for decades and decades, this is a real ripe time where we can talk to people and doors are opened, right? So we have to think about the glass as half full and not half empty, even educationally. And sometimes people have asked me, well, what did BLM do? What did they accomplish? Well, the only reason Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in the White House is because of the movement for Black lives. That's what they accomplished. Every single thing coming out of that administration, however imperfect that administration is, that's what they accomplished, right? So yeah, you didn't get George Floyd justice and policing. You didn't get the John R. Lewis and the For the People Act. Those are things we have to continue to try and get. But what you did get is pandemic relief that for 2 years actually lifted millions of Black and brown kids and white kids above the poverty line for the first time in the 21st century. Those aren't things to sneeze at just because you ain't poor. Because that's what we do, right? What we do in 2016, people, they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. They voted for Jill Stein, right? I didn't. I voted for Hillary Clinton and criticized her for super predator and welfare reform. You know why? Because I cared about the people who were going to die under Trump. And I cared about the Supreme Court. I cared about the Supreme Court. So we got 6-3 because some of us, right, they did shenanigans. Shelby versus Holder changed the arithmetic and the algorithms of the Electoral College. I get it, and I write about it in the book. But some of us, we become too vain, right? We become narcissistic, right? And that's where I love King. King always, and he pushed everybody on this, was saying, think about other people before you think about yourself. And what King called it, and he said he had to struggle with it too, he said we needed a revolution of values. So it wasn't about you voting for somebody who you feel so good about. It was saying, who's going to do the least damage to all these people who I'm professing to love, right? So how are you going to vote for somebody who's not going to win, where there are all these babies who you don't know, but you profess to love, who are going to die in detention? Some of these kids died never seeing their parents again, right? But then you claim you love everybody. You love everybody, right? Except those abstract people who you love when they conflict with your own vanity, right? So, yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question.
So I'm in high school, and I just wanted to bring up like how there's a lot of performative activism that I see like on TikTok and in 2020, like the Black Squares trend. And I wanted to ask the question of how you suppose we succeed during this third Reconstruction and push the narrative on future generations, rather than continuing this trend of performative activism?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's your name?
Kaylin.
Kaylin? Caitlin?
Kaylin.
Kaylin. Okay, Kaylin. And what year are you in?
I'm in 10th grade.
10th grade. Okay, that's great. Thank you for the question. That's awesome. You know, I mean, I think the performative activism, we're always going to have some performative activism because that's how social movement works. So there was some performative activism during the first Reconstruction in the 19th century. There was some during the Civil Rights Movement. Some people, their whole deal is that they went to the March on Washington and they dine out on that for 60 years. They say, you know what? You know, I was at the March on Washington before you were born. And then if you dig and ask if they ever did anything else, they're like, nope, no. But I went to the March on Washington, right? You know, and so you dine out on that forever, right? Some people went to BLM demonstrations in 2020 and they're going to dine out on that till 2070. Okay. So one, I think we don't need to, we can ignore that. We can just ignore that. I think what we're trying to always do is cultivate community, and we cultivate community by sharing our stories. The first story, one thing I can tell you is that everybody in this room, and I think on the planet, is a writer, is a memoirist, is a thinker. The first story you get is your mother, your father, your grandmother, your grandfather, whatever parent figure in your life, they tell you how you came into the world. That's the first story you get. You say, hey, mom, dad, how did you all meet? Like, what did you think? I've got my youngest is asking me now all these different questions. 7.5, my daughter, right? You know, saying, how'd you feel when I was born? You know, I tell her I felt great. It was the happiest day of my life, you know, and she wants to know the story and these different. And then the second story we get is going to be the story that you're getting right now, your high school, your community, just how you fit into that. And then the third story becomes the story of the larger country, your own identity, you being young Black woman, all these different things. If away from the performative, how do we share that story in a way that actually builds solidarity with each other, both at your high school? And that could mean anything from, hey, we're gonna use the new knowledge that we have about Black women and Black women's history to kind of try to mentor each other and have peer-to-peer support, but also maybe we're going to mentor some elementary school students in the community, right? And then we connect that Black women's history to activism in DC or Prince George's County or wherever you're at, but also to what's happening in higher ed and what school, college, university you might want to go to, right? So I think the big thing for us is how do we understand our story as one that actually empowers us, but we're critical thinkers enough to know that there are all these different layers of injustice everywhere, right? And Dr. King said, you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And we're all seeing that now. I mean, the United States is taking a huge authoritarian turn. We can call it authoritarian fascism, authoritarian white nationalism. I think that this authoritarian turn, even as people talk about Hungary and Bolsonaro, and people talk about Brazil and talk about all this different stuff, I think that this is coming from American history. And I can prove it. I can prove it. This is coming from 19th century white supremacist, authoritarian fascists, people like John Calhoun, who was governor of South Carolina, vice president of the United States. What John Calhoun called racial slavery, he called it a rough discipline for Black people that was going to have to be pursued forever because these Black folks were making white people and the country so much money and so much wealth. He said it was a rough discipline for us, right? That's the country. And so there's a through line to Calhoun and DeSantis, and we can all see it. We can all see it. And that's what I'm saying. For those of us who are like, what would we have done back then? You're in it right now. That's the thing. I think some people find that scary, right? And the Haitian sister here, we talk about Toussaint and Dessalines and all this stuff, right? Sans-Souci, right? But we're in it now. We're in it, right? And so what you can do, this is where you do have more access and opportunity than our 19th century counterparts, right? Much more of us, percentage-wise, were impoverished in that context. You know, 90% of 4 million. There's more aggregate now in poverty, in prison and stuff, but there's many more of us who actually have access and opportunity. One, find out your story, right? I mean, find it out. And I think we should all do it through the lens of our identity, but understand that our identity is a particular story that is connected to a universal larger story. So as somebody who teaches Black history and does all the stuff I do, I say Black history is universal, just like all histories are universal, but it's universality through the particular lens of Black people, or a Black woman, or a Black queer woman, or a Black disabled person. And sometimes people don't get that. They'll tell us to read Shakespeare, and that's universal, and they'll tell us that Toni Morrison is too ethnic. And you're like, why is Toni Morrison too ethnic, but Shakespeare, like, we're all supposed to love Shakespeare, right? But that is part of the anti-Black episteme that we're in. And when we think about episteme, this idea of epistemology, and that's a big word for the philosophical foundations of knowledge and knowledge production. And what we're doing is pushing back against epistemological racism and white supremacy and racial capitalism that sets up a context where all the knowledge is from one perspective. It's a top-down perspective. And even some Black people are implicated. I criticize Obama in the Third Reconstruction for saying that he's a big believer in American exceptionalism. And I talk about American exceptionalism, this story that we are constantly perfecting our union. We've had shortcomings, but we're always fixing things. But American exceptionalism is based on two big lies. The first lie is that Black people are not human beings. And that's how we got away with racial slavery and all the wealth racial slavery created for Harvard, for Georgetown, for Washington, D.C., for Lehman Brothers, for all the banks. It created so much wealth. And we have all these scholars who are documenting that right now. Harvard and these places, they'll say, well, we're going to give have a $100 million fund, but they're worth $50 billion. Even when they admit it, right? And so the first lie was that they said we were non-human beings, and that's how they could get away with racial slavery. And remember, North and South and globally, in the Caribbean, in Europe, everybody was implicated in the racial slavery trade. Cotton, indigo, sugar, people, the whole deal. The second lie is that the first lie never happened. And that's why Obama on March 18th, 2008, could give that race speech where they said he gave the best speech since Lincoln, and he does a moral equivalency between racial slavery and white grievance against affirmative action. That is sick. That is sick. There is no moral equivalency between racial slavery and white people being upset over affirmative action, just like they're upset over DEI now. White supremacy has never stopped being upset or forgiven us for the end of the Civil War and the eradication of racial slavery. And he says he understands both sides. There are some issues, people, that there are not two sides of. So I say that you just sharing your story, learning more about our collective story, and that's Black folks, that's women, that's queer and genderqueer. I mean, the whole Rainbow Coalition, which Fred Hampton came up with, and our Reverend Jesse Jackson, I'll say, popularized. So we need to share our story with each other. That's going to give us solidarity and proximity and really help us, again, build that beloved community, get the political strategies. If we do that, we're going to be on the right road. It's a rough road towards Renaissance, but I believe, and when you believe, you have hope and you're empowered, but the belief and the hope is through action. A lot of people who are always upset and they're like, you know, man, what are people doing in different stuff? You find out that they're not doing much at all. You know, they're very upset. They're like, where's the movement? Before BLM, where's the movement? Well, if you're in movement, that's where the movement is, right? You don't have to see it smack dab on television. And don't worry about the performers. You're gonna outlast the performers. This is always, I always tell my students this is about a marathon. You remember the late great Nipsey Hussle had marathon, you know, he's a marathon clothing, company. This is about a marathon. This is not a 100-yard dash. So even some of the people who might be big leaders who are just sort of like comments and sort of fade and tire out. For those of us who are going to be in the struggle, we have to find things on a daily to be hopeful about. We have to. And a lot of that is through our activism, but a lot of that is listening and sharing our story and listening to other people's stories. And in that, you become more expansive. And you find out your own ability to love folks is really capacious. And again, I agree with Dr. King. This is about this bitter but beautiful struggle to create this beloved community. And we have to have a revolution of values. And King said he wasn't a believer in a kind of fake consensus. He was a molder of consensus. He wasn't trying to just achieve a consensus because it was popular. King became one of the most unpopular men in the United States at the end of his life. Why? Because he wanted all of us to have a guaranteed wage and decent housing. And again, it's instructive. It's instructive. That's the country we're living in. This nonviolent activist, he didn't die slipping on a piece of ice. He was assassinated. So that's instructive, right? All right, thank you so much. So we'll be signing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for coming out here and speaking with us. We still will be selling books right here to my right. Dr. Joseph will be signing. So if you already have a copy, come on in line. If you don't have a copy, you can also come in line to get a copy and get it signed. It's going to start at the table and then go around the mural wall. We're going to have some nice energy here. All right.